a professor of history at Simmons College, but has also been very active in a number of different social justice struggles and organizations. He's a member of committees of correspondence for socialism and democracy. He's also a member of the Majority Agenda Project, which we may explore a little bit later. So I'd like to turn it over to Mark.
Thank you. Can I unmute over here? Okay, I think what we'll do is keep it informal. And at any moment you have a question or a comment, don't worry about interrupting. That's no problem. In fact, I solicit it. I welcome it. Let me just start out by telling you a little bit about this project, because otherwise it's going to sound like an incredibly egocentric endeavor, and that's probably the last impression I want to leave. About 11 years ago, I published a book called The Cry Was Unity, Communists and African Americans from 1917 to 36. And for a long time, that had been involved in some other writing, some other projects. And I had for a long time the intention of writing a follow-up volume from 36, from the founding of a very broad Popular Front organization, which probably the largest in African American history, the organization called National Negro Congress, in February 1936. And my idea was to do a narrative to carry that story and look hopefully analytically at the 20-year period from that 1936 beginning up until the Montgomery bus boycott, which broke out in December of 1955. And I thought I would apply to the Bois Institute at Harvard for plush conditions and a nice office and the like. And in the process of trying to solicit some references, one of my referees, the great thing about getting old is that it's difficult to get frustrated and subjective about a lot of things. And this guy said, "Oh, come on, don't do this. Don't do a narrative." I was going to do it on a broad canvas because the left had broadened out considerably. He said, "That's standard stuff," which I didn't think it was, but I had to listen to this guy. But there was one aspect that he said really leaped out at him, and a paragraph I had in there in the proposal which said something about, maybe I could intersperse in the narrative some personal experiences, encounters, not great relationships by and large, but encounters with some really incredible people like Paul Robeson and Dr. Du Bois, and some little deeper level things like Lorraine Hansberry, Bayard Rustin, a pretty broad swath of people whom I had over time either met or had some exchange with, or in some instances actually collaborated with on some specific projects. And this guy said, "Man, that's what you ought to be talking about. Talk about your experiences in the movement and the interface with these crucial figures." And easily intimidatable as I am, I kind of reshaped the proposal, and sure enough, they said, "Okay, let's go ahead and do it. You write this thing." And and that's what I've been doing for the past year. I've been just writing and trying to pull together the strands of this experience by combining the memoir with a narrative. And it's a tricky thing to do, but I hope that it makes some sense. In some respects, it's easier to do, because if you really want to write a solid, thorough narrative of that incredibly rich and in many ways transforming period, it would probably take about 5-6 years of research. And at my age, I don't think that's a very realistic prospect. So I went ahead and tried doing a memoir, and that's why you see that picture up there at the beginning. And a lot of what I'm doing is, I guess you could characterize it as generational analysis. A generational study, you could argue, it probably is not as rich and as rewarding, let's say, as studies that are anchored in other categories such as class, certainly, race, gender. Of course, those factors all figure into one's generational analysis. The good thing, the interesting thing about doing generational stuff is that you could see the historic continuum a little more clearly. You could kind of measure the experience of your particular generation, you know, measured in time, say from the time you're a teenager into your middle or late 20s perhaps, with previous generations and of course with succeeding generations. Those of us who came to some degree, let's say, of political awareness in the 1940s, I think my first real sense of involvement with politics probably came when I was about 12 or 13 years old, pondering, you know, what the world was going to be with the end of the war. I remember something I never mentioned before. My public school teacher was the head of the staff at a camp, a left-wing camp called Robeson. And I remember in 1944 writing a smug little letter, as a 12-year-old kid, you know, writing a letter to him explaining to him that perhaps Roosevelt knocking Henry Wallace off the ticket and putting Harry Truman on may be a good thing in terms of electability, you know, I mean, nonsense, you know. But that was probably my first awareness of politics, and we'll get into that a little bit more with the slides. But the generation that I was part of, it's an interesting generation because we kind of stood between the 30s and the 60s, literally. We were not part of that great youth upsurge of the 1930s that was anchored largely in the labor movement and, you know, mass struggles to build the industrial union movement and to advance black liberation and world peace, etc. And of course we were kind of, you know, old already by the upsurge of the 1960s. And yet this is a generation that produced some really talented and effective people in a number of ways. It was a generation that was, I don't want to use the word victimized, but a generation that was challenged, let's say, by some specific problems. In terms of its radicalism, there were three things. First of all, there was the onset of McCarthyism. It had a devastating impact. You can go back and look at some of the stuff that went on, particularly through the early, mid, and late 50s. Those are really tough times, and the pressures were enormous. So there was McCarthyism. Secondly, there was, I guess, what you would call a relative protracted prosperity. Relative, that is, to other times of the 1950s, with a significant economic expansion that was built largely heavily upon the militarization of the economy. But that, you know, that prosperity actually, given the pressures of McCarthyism and given the complexities that the left faced during that time, especially after 1955, when the Communist Party had been pretty much the fulcrum of the left up until the early and mid-50s, and that these various movements tended to rotate more or less around the CP. The revelations about Stalin's crimes, the revelations about the ruptures and distortions of what people really believe was socialist principle had a devastating effect upon members, I would guess the majority of my generation. And the result, a lot of them retreated to academia and retreated to professions. Many of them continued on an individual basis their contributions to struggles for peace and justice and the like. Others simply retreated into, you know, personal pursuits. Some became enormously successful. Some actually, without necessarily jettisoning a core progressive principle, made important contributions to culture. Some went into the labor movement and had a significant impact in that area. But on the whole, the generation tended to fragment